All right. So our next speaker is Vincent Mourik from FG Juliet. And the title of the talk is You Uncovered Unreliable Research. What happens next?
It's a wonderful workshop so far. I'm really glad to be here and to be able to present my work on this topic, which is actually all conducted together with Sergey Frolov. But of course, I'm presenting it here and it's my perspective that I'm providing, but I just want to make absolutely clear that this is done a joint effort that I'm presenting here. So first I want to set the stage a little bit. And for that, I need to go back to my PhD days when Sergey was the postdoc in the team and I the very young PhD student. And yeah, this happened in the team of Leo Kouwenhoven in Delft. And we were the team that kicked off the research on Majorana fermions and nanowires. So trying to measure electronic signatures of Majoranas in these structures. 2012, we had the first very promising results. Everybody, we ourselves, very excited, very proud. Still am to the current date of this result. Yeah, created a lot of excitement, as many of you in the audience will know. Then, of course, my PhD lasted for another 3 years, and I did a lot of extra work together with my colleagues. We reproduced these features easily. Sergey, in the meantime, was setting up his own lab here in Pittsburgh, also reproduced these features, tried to build upon that work. And in those 3 years or so, it became abundantly clear, Henry Leck already alluded to that yesterday, that these electrical conductance signatures that we initially associated with Majoranas can actually be mimicked by trivial physics. And really the breakthrough paper there that really put for us experimentalists the spotlight onto that was work from the group of Silvano De Franceschi in Grenoble, where they, in a deliberately made quantum dot for the first time, made clear that this is a typical conductance spectrum as a function of bias voltage versus some parameter, in this case gate. You tune this device a little bit, you apply some magnetic field, you can get zero bias peaks as well. And then under the right circumstances, if you plot this right on the right scales, nice color scale, etc., this looks a lot like a Majorana type of signature as well. And this was abundantly known, I would say, by 2014, 2015, the end of my PhD, that it was very tricky. And at that point, I would say pretty much impossible to distinguish a possible Majorana signature from trivial features, trivial explanations. So that's the point where I left the group and I went for my postdoc to Sydney, worked on a different topic. Of course, you stay very actively, you actively follow the topic. I kept talking to Sergey, to other peers about the topic. And what we noticed was that after I had left sort of in this from 2015 onward, more and more papers started appearing from the Delft and Copenhagen teams that had a positive vibe to it. Like Majoranas were more and more established. They were signatures were being seen in more and more different systems and platforms. And at some point, it kind of became too good to be true. And we started to ask questions to ourselves. And we had discussions, Sergey and I, and at some point in 2019, we decided actually to look into more detail into this body of work. So Sergey requested some further data on the most striking paper from the group, from our former group, and got some data and we analyzed that. And I quickly want to walk you through that, not very lengthy. We have presented this several times before, but just to set the stage. This was about observing a quantized plateau, supposedly due to a Majorana fermion. And really the claim is an experimental phenomenological claim. The height of our zero bias peak remains constant despite changing parameters such as the magnetic field and tunnel coupling. Okay, so robust plateau, that was the claim of the paper. It was visible in the main figures. Here is the plateau as a function of magnetic field, nicely quantized here as a function of tunnel coupling. And yeah, what we found that this was a case of gross cherry picking and data cropping and data selection manipulation. Just to give you an example, here I show you about 20 different panels of these conductance peaks merging as a function of magnetic field at zero bias. And in this panel, on this slide, you can find any value between half and double the quantized value. And only 1 or 2 of them represent the quantized value and were selected for inclusion in the paper. Similarly, this plateau has a functioning gate voltage. To obtain that, it was quite heavily manipulated, the data set. The data sets were cropped, parts were taken out. None of this was disclosed, all to the purpose of visually creating a nice looking plateau. Just as another example of the type of misrepresentations that we found, there's statements in the paper such as a function of a gate voltage, this value of conductance, it wobbles and it goes up to the context value, but does not cross through it. And when you plot this parameter, the full data range, you see that for most of the gate range, it goes well above by almost a factor 1.5. Now, this body of findings was sufficient to get this paper retracted. But it was, we have this well documented, and you can read all the fine details yourself. Now, similarly, in Copenhagen, I want to put the spotlight on that as well. In a very similar device, this is a nanowire, but now with a fully closed shell around it. In this system, there was also a claim being made of flux-induced topological superconductivity. So the idea is that the Majoranas in this system, they emerge when you put a flux quantum through the shell of the wire. But it has to be an odd number of flux quanta. So the claim, phenomenologically speaking, is that whenever you have killed superconductivity at half a flux quantum, then when you are at 1 flux quantum, the zero bias peaks basically magically appears because the system self-tunes to a Majorana phase. So the claim in the paper is that this is robust, that this is present for many parameters. In reality, when we obtained some more data and analyzed that, what we found was that, in fact, you change the gate voltage a little bit, the peak splits. In another device, we found that it can be a fork. And sometimes it's there, sometimes not. They're very sensitive to the exact tuning in a device. None of this was revealed in the paper. The one and only device that didn't show zero bias peaks was actually had a paragraph describing it as this is a control device, it is a bad device that is not topological. But really, there's no way to distinguish the good topological device from the non-topological one. Similarly, in gate voltage, so this is at finite field at the special flux value, looking at the tunneling conductance, the paper says zero energy state throughout the tunneling regime. Well, we looked at a fuller range of data in the tunneling regime. So this is the entire tunneling regime that we were able to analyze. And what you see is that only in this range where the blue line is, there we found a zero bias peak in the paper figure, and in the other, about 80% of the gate range, there is no zero bias peak. But none of this was disclosed in the paper, and it was very confidently written that this is a topological phase that is robustly present in this system. Again, you can find the full details of this analysis online. So if I wrap this up, what we found in Delft is that we found a pattern, multiple papers that have had severe manipulations in there. So at this point, there are 2 Nature papers retracted, a Nature Nano corrected. We think, there's further problems with it and it should be retracted. The Nature Com under investigation. But really, there is more papers that we suspect may have problems. In the Copenhagen case, there is 1 science paper being investigated at the moment, but there's multiple additional papers between 5 and 10 where we have reasonable grounds to think that these are not reliable claims. And they really should be investigated. So that brings me really to the topic that I really wanted to discuss. This was just a primer to set the stage. What do you do when you stumble across this? This was basically not a true accident, but sort of this came upon our path. We find, and what happened was with the first set of findings, we went to our previous supervisor and told him, like, look, these are severe problems that we found, deal with it. And we got a response back that left us somewhat perplexed. And then we thought, what do we do next? So I thought of talking you through that, make a timeline, and maybe show the pivotal events, like what are the various mechanisms and events that happened. And I got terribly stuck preparing this talk. Like I couldn't make it. I got blocked. This and why? This is not at all the right picture. It's more like this, And really, it's just a mess. It's 4 years of all sorts of different events, like interwoven in a very, it's just difficult to disentangle. So I'm unable in 10 minutes, in the remaining 10 minutes, to give you a proper rundown of everything, of course. 5. Instead, I will just highlight a few aspects of what I think are relevant to us as an audience, and it's just haphazard a little bit all over the place. So getting data, how to get data for everything we do, and you've seen that in multiple talks right now. It's absolutely essential to get access to the fuller raw data. And we need typically an order or 2 orders of magnitude more data than present in the paper. Authors typically refuse or ignore your request. That's what happened in these cases. So what is the next station? Well, you go to the journals, because that's where the paper is published, right? So they have these type of statements. They have policies that in principle require sharing. And I'm sorry to say, but it's just useless. Like, the journals are not particularly helpful in getting any data. Apart from one positive case here, where that was the science paper, where actually the editors did help us in getting data. But in all the other cases, like I'm talking about order 10 papers, yeah, the editors didn't really help. So the next stop then is the institution, because that's where the data physically still is. And what happens there is that the institution doesn't really want to share. So in the Delft case, it was really a conspiracy to share as little as possible, as slow as possible, extending to the level of the executive boards. There's meeting notes there with legal teams involved, how much and at what pace they should share data with us. In the case of Copenhagen, there's plain lying about the extent of the data from the directorship of an institute there. And yeah, the university is still the current date plainly refusing to share any data. Okay? So that is about getting data. Then, of course, once you have found problems, you want to hand it over to somebody that does a full investigation, like where do the problems end, what were the causes, or which works can we trust, etc. So again, where do you turn to? The institute? The journals don't investigate, and I'm somewhat sympathetic with that. Yeah, it's really not in their capacity, I would argue, to investigate at another institution. But of course, the institutions, they don't have any incentive to do an independent, transparent investigation. And you can see that in these examples from what happened. So in Delft, they have, of course, a scientific integrity committee for these type of problems. But they required us to be prosecutors of the case. So we had to make an accusation of misconduct and bring all the evidence for that. But that's not what we are doing. We did basically fact-checking, fact-finding. So we refused to do that. And then, you know, we had some role in the process. They asked us to share our information. At the moment we did that, they kicked us out of the investigation, of course, because, you know, we were inconvenient. Throughout this entire, they spliced the case, basically splicing it along paper lines. This paper has a problem, so we investigate what happened with this paper, but we don't do anything with evidence for potential problems in other papers. So as a consequence, there are now 2 independent, disconnected investigations, and yeah, for the 3 or 4 or 5 other papers that have problems, nothing has happened yet. And of course, this allowed the authors to cover up, because by delaying all the data sharing, by having lengthy, spliced, you know, localized investigations, the authors were able to orchestrate the retractions and corrections on their own terms, point the problems out to the journals themselves. And unsurprisingly, in several cases, we found afterwards that it hadn't been a full disclosure. There were additional issues. And as I said already, this really is a type of conspiracy, I would argue, extending all across the university, from the researchers via the mid-level administration up to the executive and supervisory boards, trying to keep this under the wraps and the lid on it as much as possible. In Copenhagen, the Niels Bohr Institute initially conducted a very rapid, few days, few weeks investigation that basically was misleading and false. The director lied about certain aspects, misled the science editors, and up until that point, everything had been confidential, but at that point, they leaked our names to the press, which I consider a form of retaliation from the institution, actually. So till the current date, the university refuses to handle any complaints about data sharing. And what is quite interesting, they are taking on a complaint about this case brought to them by the science editors in a way that is inconsistent with the Danish regulations and law. The point I want to convey here is that there's a lot of cover-up and willingness going on here, and it sort of echoes what I read about the Rochester situation, where there were 3 blotched investigations until I think NSF slammed their fist on the table and made them do a proper investigation. So finally, a final aspect of this is policies. We have mentioned that already a bit in this meeting as well, and codes of conduct. So having received my entire education in the Netherlands and being Dutch, I'm quite proud of this code of conduct. So we have a policy, and all the researchers and institutions in the Netherlands need to adhere to that. And it's a nice and pleasant document that I recommend you actually reading. But the reality is that it's very well outlined. Everything is in there. But in reality, it's a paper tiger. It's unenforceable. Okay, so the university does an investigation, you're unhappy with it for whatever reason. The oversight body basically doesn't do anything and passes the hot potato back on. So we have informed the National Academy, etc., all the academic levels in the Netherlands. And what happens, it's being passed on, and it gets back to the institution. So all you are left with is going public, investigative journalism. You need to go at extraordinary efforts, basically, to get a case exposed and brought. So to wrap this up, I think this is a dire situation, honestly. It's extraordinarily difficult to expose a problem and get it investigated and get it resolved, okay? You start from, as a normal scientist, you start from some fact-checking, fact-finding, and you end up with years of procedures with an unclear outcome, and basically still no end in sight. So there are many senior people here, many in leadership positions. There's many editors here, and I thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it, and I've been enjoying the workshop. But at the same time, I really want to call upon you. Yesterday in the panel, it was a nice panel, of course, but there were many explanations and excuses, I thought. But you are the ones that really are in the center here. You are in the center of what I consider the problem. You have a lot of power, and we don't want you to play God, but perhaps you can put your foot down a little bit more often and be more helpful to people that want to investigate and try to understand what's going on with certain works. Because as a final note, I think the burden that it places on people like myself, on you listened to Henry yesterday, James Hamlin, Charles, Sergey, the burden is heavy. This is 4 years of my life that I spent professionally dedicating significant resources on this topic. It's affecting my personal life too. Those are my primary years. 2 of my kids were born in those 4 years. And the burden, I'm not regretting it, and I would do it again, but it is a heavy burden. So I'm really calling upon all of you, like, how many more of these cases do we need? How many more people like myself need to make such sacrifices? And how much longer do we need to continue this type of work before, as a community, we will act and speak up? Thank you.
Any question?
Thank you. That was a lot of great talks here. I don't really have an answer, but I want to, you mentioned there are many older researchers here. I just want to say just a tiny, I don't have any problem with that. I just wanted to mention a little bit of history. My background is really, I built a lot of my reputation on zero bias peaks. Andrea bond states, time reversal symmetry breaking, reflectionless tunneling, and my feet were really held to the fire. And I didn't have a problem with that. I had my experiment in days of view graphs. I had my experimentalist macho view graphs. You know, how many samples did I measure? What were the microanalysis? In those days, I'm doing planar tunneling, not STM. I have no problem publishing reams of 2-column data ASCII. It wasn't a problem. And so I was asked these questions. I would say, how do you account for this thing? And I would say, that's a really good question. And I would answer those, and I would have field dependence, angle of the field dependence, changing the counter electrode, changing the, and I could say exactly how many samples, exactly what the data were. And I guess I want to say that I could do that in my measurements, but now my kind of data is constantly discounted for the last 20 years because it's a cheap setup, right? And you can get really fraudulent, I won't say fraudulent. You can get a lot of artifacts in planar tunneling data because you're not this perfectly clean interface when you're coming down with one molecule on a tip and measuring everything. And I've had people that are friends of mine that say, oh, I've looked for that and I don't see it, so it can't be right. But they they weren't measuring the same thing. Okay. And so when I say, well, let me sit down with you and we'll discuss why you can't have a particularly rough surface to see an Andreev bound state and how it's different than a Andreev Jim, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess I'm going to end with that. What I said yesterday in the panel is it's really complex. And if I started my career 15 years ago, instead of many more years ago, I would not be successful because I don't want to do that kind of work because I can't do the diagnostics on it. And the kind of work that I do is discounted because you can see all the diagnostics. So that's all I wanted to say. But thank you for your talk. I thought it was great.
Yeah, thank you for the nice talk. I want to ask, as a theorist, how much you think theory has a role to play in this? And you talked mostly about the experimental cases, but there's, particularly with the quantized zero bias peak, well-known theorist that tries to now wash his hands of this theory, but it's in the paper, and he's not under any accusation.
I think argue that this distinction is almost artificial in these type of works, like it's a collaboration with many people involved. And there are deliberate choices being made to put matching color panels, really matching images, some coming from an experimental setup, some from a theoretical setup that suggests the correlation side by side, very common practice. And I think it's rather meaningless. It's just like fine-tuning your experiment, fine-tuning your theory calculations, make it look similar, and all have a great day and be happy with the story that you can output. But the real science, there's very little science in there, in my opinion. Yeah, look, I think this is a shared responsibility and accountability, in my opinion. Yeah. Yep.
I'm not sure it's a question to you as much as to the people from journals here, but the journals keep saying it's very complicated. I'm not sure why it's very complicated. All journals have a policy of, or most journals at least have a policy of shared data. If I make a reasonable request for shared data, and it's refused, I do not understand why the journals do not say this paper is retracted because they are violating the policy for shared data.
Yeah, I don't.
2 minutes.
Exact same thinking. And what can I say? Science was effective for us. But it's possible, apparently. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. You made this list of places, and you left out funding agencies. And I don't know if you attempted to contact the funding agencies, but in the case I'm familiar with, which is the high pressure hydrides, my collaborator, Jorge Hirsch, did try to contact the funding agencies that funded the work that, produces the data that they won't release, and he got a stone wall there as well. I'm wondering what your experience was if you went that route.
So we haven't explicitly tried it, but for example, in the Netherlands, the entire academic community is aware, including the major funding agencies. Nobody has done anything.
Yeah. So ultimately, we're doing this in the public interest, and they're the ones supplying the money for this to be done. And
in my opinion, I think it would be the most powerful approach at this point in time, threaten financially. That's, to me, for the institutions, reputation and finances are the main leverages we have over them. So you touch the funding streams, I think something would potentially happen. I think my conclusion is that in the Netherlands, at least, there is no such culture of doing that from the perspective of a funder. I have the feeling that in America, it's slightly more
It didn't
prevalent
work
or- okay,
in America as
possibly
well.
didn't work.
So if the biggest issue here is data availability, I guess I'd like to hear from the editors why something like an approach where the data repositories are hosted by the journals in some kind of standardized way couldn't get us to a better spot.